Okay, you've got me for about the next 20 minutes before we carry on. And I'm here today really to tell you about what's happening in the markets. I'm going to be talking a lot about the wider market as well, because that's what affects you too, why it's happening, as it affects you, and what to do about it. But I want to start with what John Adams, who's the second president of the United States, had to say in his defense of the constitutions of government of the United States of America in 1787. And he said, "The moment the idea is admitted into society that property is not as sacred as the laws of God, and that there is not a force of law and public justice to protect it, anarchy and tyranny commence." So I want you to hold on to that. Now, why did I start with that? Because in the understandable campaigns to promote colonial redress and cultural patrimony, it strikes me that this very important right, the right to enjoy personal property unharassed, is largely overlooked. And it shouldn't be, because the right to own and enjoy an object privately, whether a book, a map, a ceramic vase or a painting, is the bedrock upon which our entire cultural heritage is built. Now, going back millennia, we find the Babylonian princess Eneghaldi Nana, who founded the first museum in around 530 BC. And it was the establishment of private collections with the help of traders such as yourselves that sparked interest in learning about and accumulating objects into collections. Now, those collections in turn supported a vibrant international trade whose success has always been on scholarship, based on scholarship, because you're not going to succeed if you don't have a deep understanding about what you trade in, and I'm sure you will all understand that. Now, all of this activity underpinned a wider public appreciation of collecting disciplines in the arts, and a vast number of the world's leading public collections and museums, from the British Museum and the Louvre to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and the Guggenheim, were all established as a result of the generosity of private collectors. So whether you're a dealer, auction house specialist, museum curator or academic expert, you are all part of the same ecosystem, something we heard about in the earlier session, with each part depending on the others. And ignore that and the whole thing can fall apart, in my view. Now, I mention this because it informs much of what I do in campaigning for the art market, and because it should, in my view, form a much more important part of the general cultural property debate. And that's not just my opinion, I'll tell you why. Firstly, because the right to enjoy personal property unharassed is enshrined in law and in all of the leading international conventions by which we live. It's enshrined, for example, in several parts of the US Constitution. It forms Protocol 1, Article 1 of the Human Rights Act. It forms Protocol 1, Article 1 of the European Convention on Human Rights. And it forms Article 17.2 of the United Nations Declaration, Universal Declaration on Human Rights. So pretty important. And why is all of this important? Because we are at risk of losing sight of this, and in some cases have already done so, in our quest to right the wrongs of the past and to tackle international crime associated with cultural property, by which, of course, I also include books, maps, letters, and ephemera. So the good news for you all here today is that you do have rights, and the most important of laws are on your side. But of course, life's not as simple as that, as we all know. And when other rights come into play, they can conflict with personal property rights. And in some countries like France, for instance, good faith purchases and statutes of limitation can protect owners of cultural property, even where it can be shown that their original owners were deprived of them illicitly. And these countries are trying to strike a balance between the competing rights of the original owners and the later good faith owners. The question is, how successful are they in doing this? If you look at the United States, however, theft is theft, and no statute of limitations or good faith purchasing ever supersedes that. But as you can see, differing national laws effectively blur the issue of rights across borders. Countries take varying approaches to what they see as their national rights to cultural property that originally came from their shores, and these approaches change over time. Now, in doing so, they can also conflict with obligations that those same countries have committed themselves to in the past. So, to give you an example, under Article 5b, States parties who've ratified the 1970 UNESCO Convention on Illicit Cultural Property are obliged to establish and keep up to date, on the basis of a national inventory of protected property, a list of important public and private cultural property whose export would constitute damage, effectively impoverishment to the national cultural heritage of that country. So what this means is that countries may not simply reclaim everything under the convention because it originally came from there. The key word here is important. So they have to, each nation state is committed to registering its own list of what is important with UNESCO. The problem is that few, if any, actually do that, and a shrinking number honour that obligation. Mexico, for instance, one of the first countries to ratify the convention, with it coming into force there on the 4th of January 1973, now has a stringent new law, not only claiming back just about every piece of cultural property wherever it is in the world, but also banning the sale of Mexican cultural property everywhere. And it expects this to be enforced globally. This has led to calls for art and artefacts to be withdrawn from auction in places like Paris on the grounds that it is illicit or stolen. But in fact, many of these items, which have been legally exported from Mexico and traded on the market for decades or longer, are only deemed illicit by Mexico now because of its new law. Now, whilst this may seem outrageous, before we dismiss Mexico's claims out of hand, it's important to understand that not everyone in the world thinks alike, and we ignore that at our peril. If we want to resolve international differences, we have to have a far greater understanding about cross-cultural differences as well. And I had a good example of this when I was lecturing students a few years ago from more than a dozen countries. Two of them, one was from Syria and one was from Iraq, and they simply did not believe that the archaeological artefacts that had been legally traded by their countries in the past could have ever been privately owned. Even more enlightening was the discovery that they believed that if their governments ruled that items on the market internationally were illicit, regardless of whether there was any evidence to show this, then they should be returned immediately. And this was because, frankly, they didn't live in democracies, and they were used to the government's authority being followed immediately. And they were open-mouthed when they discovered that the government's rules did not apply beyond their own borders, except through things like international agreements. Nor could they believe that it was legally possible for archaeological pieces or even later antiques, including antiquarian books and manuscripts, to be owned privately. So those are the sorts of things that we need to understand if we're going to deal with the context of crime, reclamation, and all that sort of thing. So everything I've said so far sets out the background against which the art market operates, and those who disapprove of it attempt to justify their opposition to it. If you add the growing clamour for reparations and restitutions in the wake of the post-colonial backlash, it's possible to see how the picture becomes ever more confusing when it comes to competing moral, legal, and ethical standpoints. And what confuses the picture even further is that the boundaries between ethics, morality, and legality become blurred too, with the result that law enforcement can act over ethical issues, thinking it is enforcing the law when it may not be. The media reporting on this is almost always equally misleading, largely because of the failure to understand what is going on or to ask the right questions. And I say this as an editor and journalist myself of over 30 years standing, 35 years in fact. So the blurring of boundaries is important because it also influences the debate surrounding new legislation. And in my own experience advising on legislation in both the UK and Brussels, opinion on what forms logical, fair and realistic policy diverges according to these different standpoints. And that can cause problems because policy development on this basis can lead to unworkable laws. This is likely to prove more of a challenge in the EU because of the specific way it addresses the need for regulation and then it pursues it. Effectively, it faces a paradox at the heart of its lawmaking. And this is because, on the one hand, it operates what's known as the precautionary principle, which is originally devised to address environmental and safety issues, but is now widely applied to almost every proposal. And that follows the idea that a problem may arise at some point in the future, But instead of waiting for that to happen, it would be better to introduce rules to prevent it from doing so now. Now, the precautionary principle, for example, was clearly applied to the new ivory ban legislation on this basis after consultation and research showed that the EU did not currently pose a significant threat to African elephants through the ivory trade. There's a more restrictive approach, that's the more restrictive approach than in the UK, which generally prefers not to legislate unless it has already identified an existing problem. But what complicates this within the EU is that it is in direct conflict, the precautionary principle is in direct conflict with the guiding principles for legislation as set out by European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen as she prepared for office in September 2019. It's worth looking at what she said. Her principles for better policy making, which seem actually really good, very sensible and eminently sensible to me, stipulated a number of things. And she wrote to her commissioners designate, and she said, "We need to ensure that regulation is targeted, easy to comply with, and does not add unnecessary regulatory burdens. The Commission must always have the leeway to act where needed. At the same time, we must send a clear signal to citizens that our policies and proposals deliver and make life easier for people and for businesses. In this spirit, the Commission will develop a new instrument to deliver on a one-in, one-out principle. Every legislative proposal creating new burdens should relieve people and businesses of an equivalent existing burden at EU level in the same policy area. We will work with Member States to ensure that when transposing EU legislation, they do not add unnecessary administrative burdens." Key phrases here: proposals must be evidence-based, widely consulted upon, subject to an impact assessment and reviewed by the Independent Regulatory Scrutiny Board. You will ensure that they respect the principles of proportionality and subsidiarity and show the clear benefit of European action. So that's pretty clear and comprehensive to me, and it targets the needs of business, such as yours, in the way that it should do in managing legislation, so that they're proportionate to the problems that they set out to tackle and do not add unnecessary administrative burdens, and should make your lives easier. The problem here is that because legislation is prompted by the precautionary principle, in other words, the perception of a future rather than an existing problem, it can't meet those guiding principles. And that's because the evidence needed to justify the new regulation under the guidelines isn't there, because the problem hasn't arisen yet. And that means that the law cannot be proportionate or evidence-based. So without this justification, any new laws in this are likely to be seen as burdensome and certainly not likely to make stakeholders' lives any easier. And this has really been very much the case with the 2019 EU import licensing regulations for cultural property. And yet political pressure make the EU authorities claim that the evidence already exists when their own research demonstrates that patently that it does not. The result is that regulations are based on assumption rather than reality, thereby addressing the wrong issues. And it's my contention that they need to address this paradox with some urgency. And my view is that they should resort to the President's very, very good guiding principles. The UK government, having left the EU post-Brexit, has actually scrapped those rules now. That's quite contentious. Some people say that it will be open us up here to a bigger risk of crime, but that's a debatable issue. That's just one law, however, and I'm just going to quickly give you a list of the current proposals of new laws and action coming out of the EU for the art market now. We've obviously got that one we've just spoken about. There's the EU anti-money laundering legislation, which the UK is actually ahead in here. We've got restrictions on biodiversity, which impact antiques. There's an action plan to fight the illicit trade of cultural goods. And there's a European Commission tender for research out at the moment on the fight against trafficking of cultural goods. And of course, we've also got what one you'll know about, which is extended producer responsibility, which is designed to reduce waste and encourage recycling. It specifically targets online sales on Abe and Amazon. And that may be easy to register via Lucid, but it's another cost. And as you will doubtless know, books and maps are not subject to the new AML provisions, but neither are NFTs, but I bet they soon will be. I also anticipate that eventually legislators will look to take in all high-value transactions across the art market and to introduce some semblance of harmonisation globally. Certainly there's little enough of that between the EU, UK and US visions of AML controls currently. And as you can also see, before we've even got to the stage of the 2025-26 enforcement of the new import licensing regulations, the European Commission is already proposing 2 new initiatives in this area, again without providing evidence to justify them. Meanwhile, UNESCO is revising its code of conduct for the art market and has so far failed to take into consideration in its new draft any of the concerns expressed by SINOA during the consultation period. So that is obviously another area of concern. So why is all this happening? Well, we live in an increasingly complex world where globalisation has applied to the art market alongside other markets. But crucially, it's done so at a time when the art market coincidentally transformed into a mainstream investment market. And it did so after the crash of 2008, when the usual safe havens of bonds and gilts proved to be more vulnerable than expected. And what this did is that it lowered the relative risk of investing in art, with the result that banks and investment funds started to move into the art market in a significant way. If you add to that international conflict since then and the perceived risk to cultural heritage of vulnerable countries, it's easy to see why legislators and campaigners also moved in on the market. The internet too, with its digital payments, online sales, are now a significant issue with black market trading via social media. And you can see that it poses a challenge in a way that it didn't 10 years ago. Cryptocurrencies and NFTs are going to be the next issue to tackle. But let's not forget that there is crime out there and that individuals, businesses and countries need to safeguard themselves against criminals. The market's now directly regulated to a degree in this country by HMRC for the purposes of AML and may become more so as crime gets more sophisticated. The challenge is getting the balance right, and various factors make that difficult. The first is the lack of reliable data and the viral effects of bogus data, disinformation. This is an area I work in a lot, and the latter is disseminated widely via the internet for a variety of reasons. Frankly, direct propaganda in pursuit of alternative agendas, inaccurate reporting, and also the failure to check facts. Calling this out and providing reliable, verifiable evidence matters. And we have been effective in changing the debate over the years as a result across the market. Cultural property, whether it is books, fine art or antiques, is a highly useful tool for soft power diplomacy, as the multiple bilateral agreements between the United States and other countries illustrate. These memoranda of understanding may set out to help forge cultural, political, diplomatic and economic links between nations, but they are now seeming to become a serious threat to the art market, with innumerable seizures at customs in recent months, and it's clear that they're being harnessed as a tool to bypass laws and conventions, including the UNESCO Convention, for political expediency. And essentially, the art market is the patsy as countries jockey for geopolitical position. Laws established to reclaim cultural patrimony or items sold off during the colonial period or later tend to include unfair retroactive elements, without which they would not work. However, attempts to enforce them come up against those human rights that I detailed at the start of this speech. Whatever we do in future, we need to engage with lawmakers and those forming policy in a way that takes their concerns seriously. But we also need to campaign better as an industry to understand the people and processes that we need to harness to make our arguments heard and to ensure we are taken seriously. And we must be clear about how to engage in the political process more effectively. Being proactive in setting rather than following the agenda also matters, as SINOA showed with its campaign in March for a fundamental review of lawmaking in the wake of yet another report, the US Treasury AML review, failing to find any noteworthy link between the market and terrorism financing. To illustrate what I mean by effective action, if you think about what you have to do when objecting to a planning application near your home, you may think the design ugly, you may not want to lose your privacy or a treasured view, but unless you object on valid planning grounds, you will get nowhere. And it's the same with the political process. I realise I'm coming to the end here. I just want to really conclude with ILAB, for example, has made an excellent start with a missing books register, with a strong committed statement of intent against theft, forgery and fraud. It's a particularly useful way to support law enforcement and other bodies who are trying to promote best practice. But in doing all this, we must all remember that that balance includes your rights. I think a couple of the things that came up earlier today indicate to me that maybe the book trade is slightly ahead of everyone else. But I think the key issues when we're looking at are issues with provenance, issues with crime fighting, and issues with what actually constitutes ownership and who should be owning property, particularly books and things like that. That's as much as I've got to say at this stage. I'll be open to questions a bit later, but thank you very much. Okay.